So crazy.
We did have a tree fall in the back, but it's not big and not close to the house. That night, it was so windy.
Yeah.
And you know, it would have been 3 or 4 weeks ago. It might have been.
That's the same night mine
Might have been the same. Anyway, I remember looking outside and seeing those trees going. And I said, please don't let it.
Well, the other way. The other way.
That's what I was hoping all along, but it didn't.
Didn't work, huh?
I didn't get my wish.
Didn't hit your house, did it?
Huh?
Did it hit your house?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the garage.
It destroyed my garage.
His fell across the garage.
Oh, great.
You can relate to that.
Yeah. Mine got lucky. I got lucky, really. I mean, it hit the garage, but it hit my chimney. And I mean, there was a big circle on my chimney where the bulk of the tree hit it, but it just splintered through. The guy looked at the chimney, came and inspected. He says there's not a crack in it. He says if this house had been built today, that chimney would be all over the next year.
Good morning. Good morning.
There will be none of that.
Man, I hope not. I didn't sleep too good last night.
Uh-oh.
I'm struggling.
I slept real good last night.
I've been sleeping pretty good overall. It's one of those,
Yeah, it happens
kept
occasionally.
waking up uncomfortable, slept wrong and things were sore and I just didn't work out.
I transitioned, got rid of the heavy comforter. I was baking myself to death.
Yeah.
We're now into springtime, not
Yeah.
winter.
My mom makes quilts and she made a couple for us that are, you know, comforter size. And we just stick to those because they're not too hot and they're not too cold. It just works out, you know. Usually in the winter, my wife will actually get an extra blanket and throw it over top of her side. But yeah, the big like squishy comforters though, they get, you know, some of those get extremely. They get even in the wintertime. I don't want them to get too hot.
I don't know what too hot is.
Neither does my mom. And Jessica,
She was born and raised in Long Beach, California, and she's brought her California blood with her.
Unfortunately.
well, my mom's was raised here, but she'll be, you know, she's one of those people that'll sit outside in the summertime with like a blanket or something. You know, what are you doing? I don't know.
I don't believe people at work have ever seen her without a coat on.
Good morning, guys. Yeah, my mom's very similar to that. Jessica's gotten to where she gets hot really. She's more like me nowadays. Her body's just changed over time, and so we're closer than we used to. We were, you know, total opposite. She was cold, I was burning up, that sort of thing. But all right, well, it's 10, so we can get started. For announcements, we have a few. They're still looking for graduates to list in the first light that will be coming out on June the 14th. So if you have any up and coming graduating seniors in your family and want to have them, you know, their names put in the first light, just notify the church office. Hey, Linda. VBS training. Again, those training days are May 22nd at 10 a.m. and then May 24th at 6:30 p.m. Both of those are in room 105, and that's they're both the same training required for anyone who's going to be helping out with Vacation Bible School. Let's see, potluck dinner and trustee town hall discussion. So potluck dinners are resuming on Wednesday, May 25th, and the potluck kicks off at 5:30, shortly before the Bible study. And it's there's also this says it's going to be followed by a trustee town hall discussion at 6, which I assume will not be. Maybe it will be in the fellowship hall. I'm a little confused about that one, so I guess it will be. So maybe the town hall discussion is on that particular day. Maybe that's happening instead of Bible study.
Is there an agenda for that?
Not on here. I assume there is one. I was wondering that too. Maybe it's just general, but it's trustee specific. It says so. I know there's quite a bit of there's a number of big deal projects and discussions that need to happen. So I assume that's I won't mention any of that stuff here just in case I'm wrong, but I assume that's what is going to be happening.
That's what it's on.
Yeah, Bobby confirmed. Passport Kids Camp meeting for kids and parents is on June the 5th at noon in room 105. So if you're got a kid going to Passport, or you're attending as a chaperone or something, I think, or this may just be for kids and parents. Either way, that meeting to get all the info is June 5th at noon in room 105. Vacation Bible, man, my goodness, didn't we just have Vacation Bible School? Vacation Bible School is June the 6th through June the 9th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And you can register online at www.firstbaptistvbs.org, or you can get a form in the church in the narthex in the lobby down there to sign up, to register. New Wednesday nights. It says we'll be doing our prayer meeting as normal and then spending some time learning and trying out we talked about this previously. Spiritual practices. It says we have a wealth of traditions that our ancestors have been using for centuries to help them connect with God and with one another. And we're going to be taking the time to listen to that wisdom. And so we're going to be exploring, I guess, some spiritual practices on Wednesday nights. It doesn't, I guess, starting Wednesday. It doesn't give any dates, so maybe this up and coming Wednesday that'll kick off. And then nightlife groups, which we mentioned this previously as well. In August, we're going to start small groups and small group meetings, which will meet in the homes of congregants here at the church for a book study and conversation. And this is particularly on Jen Hatmaker's Simple and Free. So this is already put together. They know what book they're going to look at. But if you want to volunteer your home or to lead the small group, that's what they're looking for. It's just to notify the church office if you'd like to lead this small group on this book. Obviously, you need to read the book, or if you want to offer your home for this get together. Those two don't have to be the same. So anyway, that's all for the announcements. Let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get into Sunday school. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for another beautiful day, and thank you for the opportunity again to gather in your name with with your people, and we just pray that you would accept our worship today and be with us in mind and body. Fill us with your Spirit. Be with us in this class, Lord, as we discuss things pertaining to you. Help us to learn to learn truth, to seek truth, and to find it. And just help us to grow closer to you through these things. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so before I get started, we're looking at a new argument today. Well, give me one. So last week we wrapped up talking about the argument from contingency, that was primarily developed by the Gottfried Leibniz, the philosopher, and then kind of simplified in more modern times by philosophers. And we're looking at these arguments for the existence of God. And so we started with the argument from contingency, that anything that exists has to have an explanation for its existence, whether that be that it is that explanation is that it is necessary or that it's contingent. So now we're moving on to a new argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, as it's called. And the argument here is, just a brief recap, because we talked about this already. This argument was largely refined, again, within medieval Islamic theology, and that's where the name Kalam gets its namesake. The word Kalam is the Arabic word for medieval theology. And in particular, it was this 12th century theologian named medieval Islamic theologian named Al-Ghazali who formulated this argument in its most sophisticated form. And he did this in order to refute the claim of Greek philosophy that the Greek philosophy which denied that God created the universe. If you'll remember, it was a common view in Greek philosophy to understand the universe as eternal. In Greek philosophy, God may have shaped the universe and given it the order that it has today, but the universe was always there in some fashion, and God just used essentially that material to fashion the universe as we know it. So, but He didn't create it out of nothing. In Greek, that was that wasn't a common idea among Greek philosophers. So, in Greek philosophy, the universe, existed necessarily and therefore existed from eternity. So Al-Ghazali was concerned that, Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by this idea. And so as a response, he argued that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd and that the universe must have had a beginning. And so in order to show this, he argued that nothing can begin to exist without a cause, that the universe must have begun to exist, and therefore it has a cause for its beginning. And so the argument has these three simple steps. It's two premises. First premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The second premise is the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning. So that's Ghazali's argument. And this is, like the argument from contingency, this is a logically sound argument. And so just as we did with the argument from contingency, we want to take a look at each of the premises here and ask whether or not the truth of each premise is more plausible than not. So let's look at the two premises of the argument, starting with premise one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. Since Al-Ghazali's conclusion is particularly about the universe, you can simplify this argument, which I've done on that paper. There's a second version of the argument below the original argument. You could just simply say, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. So, simplifying an argument is often a good thing to do in order just to help avoid distractions that are irrelevant to the argument. So rather than saying everything that exists, because then you might come up with all kinds of questions, just to focus on the matter at hand, you could just start, premise one could be restated as, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. So we're going to look at three reasons in support of this premise. The first is that something cannot come into being out of nothing. Something cannot come out of nothing. William Lane Craig says that to claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician, pulls a rabbit out of a hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. And I agree. I think that's a fair statement. To claim that the universe just popped into being out of nothing for no apparent reason really does seem worse than magic. Just imagine, just to think about this, just imagine all of a sudden, a fully functional vacuum cleaner just popped into existence right here next to me. I mean, that might be a divine, pointer that, this room really needs to be cleaned up or something, but that would have a cause, that would be, that would have, but just to think of it just popping into being out of existence or popping into existence out of nothing, it just sounds absurd because it is. So I don't think anyone really believes that things can just pop into being without a cause, but you get the point. Something cannot come out of nothing. Secondly, if something can come into being from nothing, then, what is the explanation for the fact that we just don't see this happening anywhere ever in the universe? Why do we not just see things popping into being out of nothing? It's a fair question. Why don't we see vacuum cleaners or bicycles or dinosaurs, come into being from nothing? What would make the universe the exception to this rule that only universes come into being out of nothing? And, I hate to harp on this because I think I've already talked about it a little bit, but just remember that the word nothing is a term of universal negation, like nobody, none, or nowhere. Nobody, it means not anybody. None means not one. Nowhere means not anywhere. And nothing means not anything. I'm sure you all know this. This isn't, new to any of you, but I think the point needs to be emphasized because apparently, and some of you guys may have come across this too, and from what I've read, the word nothing does get misrepresented or distorted a little bit in the realm of popular science. What happens is that the word nothing gets used, say, in modern physics sometimes to describe things like a quantum field or a vacuum. They'll talk about these things and they'll label them or describe them as being nothing. But these things they're not actually nothing. By definition, a quantum field, for example, or a vacuum, these things are something. Quantum fields are made up of particles, and they're considered to be physical in nature. They're given physical descriptions. And similarly, a vacuum in physics is just this kind of partially empty space. But it's not just empty space; it's surrounded by physical things. But this empty space contains little to no matter at all. A perfect vacuum is one that would be completely void of matter. But that only exists conceptually. That doesn't exist in the real world that anyone's ever discovered. It's purely theoretical. But you get the idea. These things are not nothing in the plain sense of the word. These are physical realities, and so they're clearly not nothing. They are something. And so it can be very misleading or confusing for us lay people who hear these terms thrown around and described as nothing sometimes in science, or when the word nothing is used this way. So to repeat, if things actually can come into being out of nothing without a cause, then it seems that we should be witnessing this at least sometimes, if not all the time, since there's no reason why things couldn't pop into being out of nothing since there is no cause. So it seems like we would just see it regularly, maybe often.
Well, but that assumes that we see everything. I mean, one of the problems I have with this argument is that we don't see everything. We can't see everything. We can't understand everything. Mm-hmm. If you go back and look at nothing as a vacuum, actually it has space. Mm-hmm. It has a distance, a unit, a volume. Those are all functions of the universe that we are in. Mm-hmm. If that didn't exist, then I would say, yeah, that's nothing. Mm-hmm. And God created the universe out of nothing.
Right.
But we're finite relatively intelligent people,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't see everything. We only live on this world. And, the rest of the universe could have magics that we have no idea about.
Well, fair enough, but everything that we've been able to see, and we can see a whole heck of a lot, there is no evidence to,
Right.
So that's just kind of an argument from silence, I guess, kind of sort of thing. But I see what you're saying. But from everything that we know, and we do know a lot, and we continue to learn more.
Yeah. But
This
we don't know everything.
This idea is always falsified and never verified. It's always it's always verified that nothing does not come from or something does not come from nothing. That idea has never been falsified.
And the more we know, the more it's true.
Yes, it just continues, and as we do grow in knowledge and our, and things in discovery, like Gary was pointing out, there are plenty of areas of that are left to be discovered and things to be learned. But as we progress, it just continues to get verified. So we have to go with that. But I see what you're saying. The fact is, we just don't witness this happen at all. We don't witness something come from nothing ever. It just doesn't happen. And so we have no reason to believe that it's possible. For something, we do what we do know, and what we have reason to believe without any doubt at this point, is that for something to begin to exist, it must have a cause. Now, what a typical objection to this might be, okay, if everything, someone might say, if everything that exists has a cause, then what is God's cause? They might even imagine that they've said something really profound when they ask this question. But can anyone point out the problem with that? If God exists, what is the cause of God?
He is the one thing outside of this box.
Right. Why? Why is God outside of this box? Why is God not? So the answer is, first of all, it would be a misunderstanding of the premise, because premise 1 does not say that everything has a cause. Premise 1 specifically says that everything that begins to exist, or in the simplified version, if the universe began to exist, it has a cause. So something that is eternal, for one, would not need a cause, since it never comes into being. That's part of its being. Eternal. So God is eternal, and He is uncaused.
Use the parental argument, just because.
Just because I said so. Yes. But our understanding of God, and what we've talked about already, is God is a necessary being and that sort of thing. That removes God from this objection. And this, notice that this isn't special pleading for God. Because this is exactly, for example, what the atheist says about the universe, that the universe is eternal and uncaused and just exists inexplicably. The problem is, we have good evidence that the universe is not eternal, that in the past, but that it did have a beginning.
Well, how do they? Obviously, they don't believe cosmology. How do they explain the Big Bang and how the universe began with that?
Well, I think I might have mentioned this before. There have been people, Stephen Hawking and some others, have come up with, models for how the universe might exist eternally. But we have no reason to believe that any of those things are in the real world. These are mathematical models. These are concepts that people have built with axioms and that sort of thing in place, rules in place that would allow for the universe to just be eternal. But I'm not smart enough to regurgitate all of them here. But from what I've read, even those models, at a certain point, they can be dismantled pretty good as far as them being a solution to the problem. And then a third area, and kind of getting into what we're saying here, a third area of reason in support of premise 1 is that common experience and scientific evidence continually confirm the truth of premise 1. And it's like we just said a second ago. Premise 1 is never falsified. It's always being verified, and so it's difficult to imagine why anyone would ever object to the idea that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. So at this point, what, the atheist or whatever, someone, the objector, at this point, what you would do is you would object to the second premise. The second premise of the argument is the universe began to exist. So, and that's where we kind of get into these, these models might come up to explain the eternality or the eternal past of the universe. But this is the more controversial of the two premises, since it's not just simply, merely obvious that the universe began to exist. It's not something that's just plainly obvious to us. In order to argue convincingly for the beginning of the universe, one has to examine, and give an account to both the philosophical arguments as well as the scientific evidence in support of this claim. So, when considering the philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe, we can start with Al-Ghazali, the guy who we can thank for this argument, that if the universe Al-Ghazali's argument is that if the universe never began to exist, then there has to be an infinite number of past events prior to today, because all these events would be infinite in the past if the universe is infinite and eternal in the past. But Al-Ghazali argued that an infinite number of things cannot actually exist. And so, therefore it follows that there cannot have been an infinite past in order for the universe to be eternal. What Al-Ghazali recognized back in the 12th century, and what many modern philosophers still today recognize, is that a potentially infinite number of things could exist. But what they deny is that an actual infinite number of things can exist. Do you understand that distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite?
No.
Okay, so it's important that we understand this distinction between the two, between a potential and an actual infinite. A potential infinite is never complete. It is indefinite. Elements can continually be added, forever and ever, progressing towards infinity, but you don't ever actually reach infinity. With a potential infinite, you never actually arrive at, okay, I have an infinite thing. But you can just keep working towards it. Infinity is simply this kind of conceptual limit that's never actually achieved. For example, take like something finite like a distance. Let's say a mile. Take a mile and then cut that mile in half, and then cut it down into quarters, and then cut it down into eighths and sixteenths and 30-seconds. You can just keep doing this forever. You're never going to reach the infinitieth, that's not a word, but the infinitieth division of it to where you're done. I've finished. I have an infinite, parts of this finite distance.
Greek philosopher named Zeno.
I don't know. That name sounds familiar, but
I think that's in essence of what he said.
Oh, okay.
Is you could keep dividing it, and
Yes.
until they found out that there were atoms, he was right.
Yeah. But you could do, anything that's made up of parts. You can. How where does it end potentially?
Well, atoms at that time were indivisible.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that you don't have an atom anymore, but an atom is like a collection of things.
Yeah.
But you could just keep dividing this endlessly, and you would never actually arrive at infinity. But it's potentially infinite because you can just keep dividing forever and ever and ever. Do you see what I'm saying there? Does that kind of make sense? You would never actually have an infinite number of divisions or parts, but you could just keep going at it forever. And most of us are probably familiar with the way that this type of infinity is notated in mathematics. It's the lazy 8, as they call it. It's the 8 that's, that just laid down and got tired. This is the type of infinity that's used in I think calculus when notating something with infinite limits. Something that's potentially infinite is what the lazy 8 is used to talk about. In contrast, you have what is called the actual infinite. Now, the actual infinite is complete. It's what it sounds like. It's infinite. In contrast to something growing towards infinity, the actual infinite arrives there. It just is that. It is infinite. It's complete and no longer moving towards infinity, but actually involves an infinite number of things. And this kind of infinite is also used in mathematics, but it's notated with a symbol that's actually a Hebrew letter called an aleph, and it's just a funny looking X kind of, but I couldn't draw one if I tried, but it looks like an X. Take my word for it. You can find, if you're in Microsoft Word or something and you go look at the symbols, insert a symbol and go to the Hebrew, you'll find an aleph and you'll see what it looks like an X. But the actual infinite is immediately confusing to think about, right? Because anytime I think about infinity, what I'm thinking about is something that's potentially infinite. Like it just keeps going into infinity. But an actual infinite is a complete, an infinite, something, it's complete. And I just don't even know really how to think about that. But there are some good ways to try to wrap your mind around it. An actual infinite is confusing, but in like mathematical, in a mathematical set, an actual infinite occurs when a collection or a set has the same number of members as the whole collection. So like even a part of an infinite set would have the same amount of members as the whole set itself does. Everything is just infinity. Everything is just infinite and complete that way. That probably does not help you at all. But think about this. Think about all the natural numbers. That's even and odd numbers together. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the odd numbers with all the natural numbers, if you just cut out the odd numbers, let's just say that all natural numbers are infinite. You can just count them all infinite to infinite. If you just take out all the odd numbers and just count them, well, that's also infinite.
Right.
3, 5, and even numbers is the same. And then you put them together, still infinite.
It's hard for us finite beings to even conceive of infinity.
It's hard to conceive of infinity because the reality of it is an actual infinite is kind of an absurd thing.
Yeah.
Mathematicians have designed ways of talking about it in non-contradictory ways, but that's just what that is. It's just a way of having this kind of mathematical discourse around this theoretical concept, I think. But you see what I'm saying? All natural numbers include not only an infinite number of numbers, but so do all odd numbers or all even numbers. And then if you add them together, even if you remove all the even numbers, you still have an infinite amount of odd numbers. And then
if you add them together, you get 2 infinite.
Yeah. So you get what I'm saying, though. The two sets are equally infinite. Infinity minus infinity would still just equal infinity in this case. So what Al-Ghazali is claiming is that while potentially infinite collections can exist, that's to say that collections that are always growing, that are always finite at any point, but growing towards infinity as a limit, that can exist. But there cannot be a collection that is actually infinite, that actually has an actually infinite number of members in it. And it's bizarre to even imagine this occurring in the real world, right?
Sense of timeline that's just like saying that something is not infinite yet, but growing toward infinity says, well, it has a beginning, right? And
yes.
Saying something's already infinite, that means it doesn't have a beginning because it goes on
right
infinitely into the past.
It's infinite in the past and infinite in the future. But yes, so that's another way of thinking about
sitting here in the present. If something has no beginning, well, it's already infinite because it goes on infinite in the past.
Right. Exactly. And there's problems with that as well. Actually, Al-Ghazali treats that as a totally separate argument. Can something be infinite into the past? But like I said, it's bizarre to think about. I'm sure that I don't know. I don't know if you are, but if you're like me. When I think of all the natural numbers and then I think of removing all the odd numbers, well, then I think I have half of the natural numbers, right? But that's not what this would, an actual infinite would be. It wouldn't work that way. If you remove one of those collections, though, in my mind, you're left with half of the original collection, right? Half of the collection. But that's the problem with moving this sort of thing out of the conceptual realm and then into the real world. In order to do these sorts of mathematics, mathematicians have adopted, axioms and rules in order to discuss actual infinities without contradiction. And so, while those axioms and those rules do allow for mathematical discourse, it allows them to have, be successful in talking about an actual infinity. It does nothing to show that this sort of thing can actually exist in the real world, or that an actual infinite number of things can really exist. And what philosophers like Al-Ghazali and others point out is that while you can talk about, with the right axioms and the right rules in place, you can talk about an actually infinite collection of things and do these sorts of mathematics on paper. It's not something that it's just not something that can exist in the real world because it would lead to absurdities. So just to kind of get back to the argument, the implication of this for premise 2 is that, in order to avoid these absurdities, we have to deny that an actually infinite number of things can exist in the real world. That would imply that the number of past events in the history of the universe, therefore, cannot be actually infinite. It must be finite. Therefore, the universe cannot be beginningless. It must have a beginning. The universe must have begun to exist. That is that is Al-Ghazali's argument. And there's philosophers still, that would still maintain that today. That's the end of that part. Like I said, Al-Ghazali does treat it as a wholly separate argument when he talks about how you can't actually have an infinite regress into the past. We can talk about that next Sunday if you want, or we could just move on from the philosophical arguments to the scientific. So some of the modern scientific evidence for that supports the idea that the universe that came into being. So next week we'll either look further into some. We could probably talk about both, or at least start finish up with some of the philosophical arguments, and then begin looking at the scientific evidence. I'll figure it out. But I don't want to. I know it can be kind of confusing and maybe sleep-inducing to talk about some of these things. But it's important to understand those two distinctions when we're talking about infinity. Another good thing to add, I think, is that we often hear God described as being infinite and eternal, and so maybe something to point out here is to understand that the infinity of God. That when we talk about God being infinite. This is not a quantitative concept. It's not a concept we're not talking about parts of God. It's a quality. It's not a mathematical quantity. So the infinite, the infinity of God is not a collection of things made up of an infinite number of definite and discrete parts or something like that. When theologians talk about God as being infinite, it's more, it's a qualitative thing that they're talking about, a qualitative infinite, not a quantitative. So it's that's to say, when we talk about God being infinite, we're talking about God as being omnipotent and omniscience, morally perfect and eternal, a necessary being, all these things that we've talked about, all loving, all good. These are not quantitative concepts made up of parts. They're qualitative. We're talking about these attributes, these qualities of God. So when talking about God, we use the word infinite as a term for God's attributes. We're not saying that God actually involves an infinite number of parts.
You can't subdivide God.
Right. We're not trying to divide up God into parts and pieces and stuff like that. So I think that's worth throwing out there. So that'd be the difference in speaking of God as infinite versus what we're talking about here. So anyway, anybody got any questions? Or I probably can't answer them.
Yeah.
Joey does, and so does Gary.
Well, I don't have any kind of ask. I verbalize them.
Go ahead, Joy.
Yeah, well, so I guess so something that feels kind of frustrating to me about these kinds of arguments is it seems like the strategy is like you get to a puzzle and you just plug in God to as though God solves the puzzle. But I don't see quite how that works. I mean, so I think what you just said was to try to to separate. All right, let me think.
That's okay.
Um,
All right, well, just to address like what the thing you said instinctively, that like, feeling, it's a puzzle and you're inserting God to complete the puzzle. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think that what we're trying to say is that looking at what we observe and how things, work in the universe and how we understand things, that God is the best explanation for these things. It's not that we're not just trying to presuppose God and plug him in. I mean, that's not even, Leibniz arrived at, God there must be, with everything needing an explanation for an existence, there must be a necessary being. And then he described that there must be, this necessary being must have these certain attributes, an unembodied mind, because it would transcend space and temporal reality and all that stuff. And he also, it must be personal, because if God wasn't personal, if he was just kind of this static necessary thing, well, then its results would also be necessary. Like that would, you could say that the universe would be necessary because it's a result of the necessary being. But if God's personal, then that explains why just at some point he just decides to create the universe, and the universe isn't just a necessary result that's also eternal. I just added some stuff there. I didn't mean to make that confusing, but I think that's the way. We're not trying to take God and fill in the puzzle. We're trying to say that everything that we have in this puzzle just points to the existence of God. I think we would look at it from a different way. But
okay, so thank you. That's a little bit helpful.
Okay.
But I guess so. I still have the question. So the argument is about the universe beginning to exist.
Yes.
The universe can't. The universe must have had a beginning.
Right. Yeah, that's what Al-Ghazali is arguing here. Was that he argues that the universe does have a. Basically at the root of his argument, the universe began to exist, and it must have begun to. We can know this through, thinking about in the concept of infinity and a potential infinite versus actual infinite, that sort of thing.
Right, but I understand that, like what you said at the end about the infinity of God is something different than the kind of infinity we're talking about.
Yeah, where it's almost, you could almost argue that we're using a distorted, definition of the term infinite. We're not using it the way that we're talking about in Al-Ghazali's argument. So I may have just thrown in confusion I just thought I would throw that in because we do use that term infinite a lot to talk about God, but I think it's an important distinction that we're not talking about God as God having infinite parts or something that we can, count and cut into pieces, even if it's in an infinite number of pieces. We're just talking about God as infinite. It's just a way of saying, in my understanding, saying that God is infinite is just the same way of saying that he's maximally great, that he has all these superlative attributes to their highest degree, and the term infinite gets thrown into as a synonym for that kind of. So
do you use unmeasurable as an appropriate synonym for that sort of?
I think so, because we're talking, again, these are superlative attributes, right? They're to their highest degree, which we're not even. So maybe, immeasurable would be almost like using the word infinite or something like that. In the sense
that, we can't say God is, this big.
He's 11 great, right. Yeah.
Or,
it's just a way, of not putting a limit on it, I guess.
But so I suppose like the most charitable interpretation of that is you're not saying that God is only quantitatively infinite, but also qualitatively infinite. But I like it.
I would say we're not saying quantitative at all.
It seems like you need to. I mean, I'm not sure how you get away from that. So
I think maybe you could get in quantitative talking about God existing eternally, so you could.
Okay, so suppose you say God existed eternally.
Uh-huh.
So part of this argument about the universe not existing eternally was
It's
So
based.
many-
It's
like events.
it's based on you can't have an infinite series of events into the past.
Okay, well, so like, what do you want to? So I guess this is where it seems like you put in God as the answer to that, but it doesn't explain why doesn't, if God existed eternally, did he, like, do mental events count as events? And if,
It's a really good question, and one that William Lane Craig would say no, that they don't. That I would have to read up on this. I've read on this before in the past, but I do know that some would argue, and I just know Craig is an example, but there are others would say that So what we're talking about here is. So Al-Ghazali is thinking of the universe, that's where time and space come from. That's where the past, there is, but before the universe existed, again, you had God, but as far as the universe goes, there was just nothing. There was God and not anything. But God, you wouldn't say God existed in time at that point because time didn't exist at that point. So maybe there's some sort of God time, but I mean, that's just a made up word. I'm just trying to help us wrap our minds around it. But so Al-Ghazali is specifically talking about how the universe works. Now, I think what you're trying to talk about is, well, when there was just God, how do we understand his eternal existence? And then, how does time work there? And then that would get you into a question, which I've read, asked, and talked about. Was God just sitting there static, doing nothing eternally? Or if he was having thoughts or mental states or whatever, does that not count as some sort of, events that are happening in like a chronological order? And I know that William Lane Craig has argued that no, we don't have to. You don't have to think of mental states as requiring time. I will have to, and I like that question, and I would like to answer it here, but I'll have to go back and read up and see what he says on it. I can't remember off the top of my head how he explains it. It's been a while since I've read up on that, but it's a good question. You're getting into some deep areas of philosophical thinking.
Would part of this argument say that, or at least I don't think this argument is saying that if we did claim that there could be an infinite number of past events and that the universe could be infinite, that means there's no God? I think that's kind of the other way to look at sort of,
maybe
what I'm hearing from your question.
I don't know. I guess that might be an argument you could. Al-Ghazali doesn't try to say, none of these guys are presupposing God in their arguments. They may presuppose God exists because they're believers, but they're not God is not presupposed in these arguments. So Al-Ghazali is going to give reasons for thinking you can't have a series of past events because it's absurd to think about. And actually, I will just talk about this next week because I think it'll be fun. You can talk about, there's a thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. And it's to explain the ridiculousness of an infinity in the actual world. I don't have, just to even give you the setup of the Hilbert's Hotel would take more time than we have before church starts, but we'll talk about that next week. That doesn't answer what Joey was asking. It's a similar but unrelated question, but I will read up on that and we'll talk. I'll give you what William Lane Craig and at least one view on like God's mental states and versus and how that works and there being no time and that sort of thing.
It seems important to make a distinction. You could have maybe some other time that's not, or call it time that's not associated with our.
Well, that's why I said
universe.
You could have like God time or something, but I can't. That was just something I threw out there. But that wouldn't be time, I guess. I don't know. I don't know how to think about
Not as we
that.
know
So.
it.
Concept. How can you create a concept
Right.
of time before time existed?
Right. You're just talking about
Before our
something.
time, it can be some other thing, right?
Yeah, and then even saying the words "before our time" implies, time.
Or outside of our
It gets
time.
outside of our time. So, but that's
Did time exist before
I remember
time
reading what
existed?
Craig said, and I thought it sounded pretty good. So I'll fill you guys in on that here, and don't ask me to support it in some great way. So do with it what you will. But I found it. I think I remember finding it okay, I was good with it. So, but we'll meet and talk more about this stuff next week. Thanks for the good questions, Joy. Taking me into the deep waters.
Next installment.
Yeah.